All right, and I believe we are on. How you doing today?
Really good, man. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for being a part of the show, of the channel. I usually try to. I had a very fun year this year, meeting people and doing interviews. But of course, now that I have been introduced to Skype instead of traveling all the way to Houston, while I would love to do that, but it is easier to talk to you over Skype. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for the viewers?
Okay, my name is Drew. I take part in, I have a YouTube channel, Autopsy87, and I also take part in an interview show that we do bi-weekly called the Skeptic show, where we interview popular YouTube atheists and scientists and things like that.
That's great. That's awesome. Mm-hmm. Now, what is your story? Like, did you grow up in a religious family? Did your parents, did they bring you to church? Did they push religion on you? And how do you think you, I guess, changed to an atheist?
Yeah, I came from a very religious family here in Texas. The church pretty much consisted of our entire family, and it's very fundamentalist. It's Assemblies of God. I don't know if you know specifically what that is. It's kind of an offshoot of Pentecostalism, speaking in tongues, and all these kinds of things. Yeah, and everyone in my family is still religious. My mom actually teaches at a private Christian school. Church normal 3 days a week, a lot of times revivals on the weekdays and the weekends, Bible camp in the summers. I graduated from a private Christian school. And like I say, my mom actually teaches creationism at a private school.
Yeah. My goodness. Maybe it was too much pushing it on you. Some people. Yeah. That's a lot. It's interesting because some people that are atheist activists, some of them, like for example, when you watch The Atheist Experience, some of them grew up in situations like that where their parents were crazy with the religion. Others, like I think Russell Glauser, I think he grew up in an atheist family, so right. I guess it can happen. Your atheism, do you think yours was caused by, like, what? When you talk about the cause of your atheism, was it just a lack of belief in like the crazy Bible stories? Was it the lack of evidence? Was it thinking that people pushing the religion were liars? Like, what would you say caused your atheism?
I think to a certain extent, I think it was a little bit of all three, because at the school I went to where we were taught, for instance, creationism, I ended up finding out later on that I was absolutely lied to about what evolution was. They taught us things like it's cats giving birth to dogs and all these different kinds of things like that. And of course, I'd find out later on that all that was just nonsense. And as far as them being liars, no, they weren't all liars. I don't think all of them came at it from a position of purposely being deceitful. But I've even talked to some of them later on, and they've said that they thought the ends justified the means. That as long as I would end up in heaven, then it was worthwhile, pretty much being dishonest. The Bible stories, those were things that I found out because I got to the point where I think I was about 20. This was about 7 or 8 years ago. I was at the point where I was like, okay, if all this is true and what they've told me is true, then I should be able to look into positions against mine. And if I have truth, then what could possibly, what could come in my way? If God be for me, who can be against me, right? And in doing that, I ended up finding out, wow, there's some really objectionable stuff in the Bible. And all those kinds of things. And a lot of it just started to not make sense. And it is a long process, It's not, I was super devout, and then I went to bed one night thinking about it, and then there it went,
Yeah, no, you're right. I've heard that a lot from people, that it takes them sometimes. I think one of the members of the ACA said it took them like 15 years to let go of previous beliefs and everything. Yeah. So a lot of people, with what it means to be an atheist, to them is that the possibility of there being a God has not been proven just yet, and that maybe somewhere. So the question is, could a God exist? Would you be open to the possibility? I mean, if someone's investigating it.
Yeah, I guess it would really depend on what they mean by God, and that's one of the problems with the word. It's almost become like the word spiritual. When people say they're spiritual, it's it can mean practically anything. It depends on what someone would mean by God. For instance, I have a friend who considers himself, a theist, but what he calls God is just the laws of the universe. And I'm like, oh, if that's your case, then I'm right there with you because I agree. Gravity happens.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess in that instance, it would really depend on what exactly how they define God, what they meant.
Did you ever deal with like a fear of hell or a fear of punishment? Sometimes people, when they're giving up their beliefs, they think some people even think there's gonna be a penalty in this life, or I'm sure you've experienced that. Like if I stop believing, I'm gonna be punished or whatever.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. And it actually took a few years before. I mean, every once in a while now, I'll still get like a little bit of it, but I normally get it because it's such a big belief in my family. Like anytime I have a conversation and religion comes up with my mom, she starts crying because this is something that she believes in. She's forced to believe that because I don't believe, not believing is like the one unpardonable thing. It's just you don't believe something. So when she looks at me, she thinks that. But do I think about it myself? Hardly ever anymore. But it took years to get over that because ever since you're a child, that's just drilled into your head that one day if you don't believe, and also not just thinking that about yourself, but even about the people that you love that maybe didn't go to church and things like that, you're forced to think that about them too.
Without there being like a judgment, I'm sure you've seen me ask this question before. Like if there's Christians believe when we die, or we're going to go and be judged by God, and all the things you did wrong you're going to pay for. Without something like that, could someone get away with a crime? Would it be better if we had something like that?
Well, I guess it kind of goes into a little bit of it might even go a little bit into the moral question of would that make it right if there was a judgment? Would it make it morally right? I know one thing that was a big turnoff when I started my deconversion process was the idea of Christian heaven, and probably a lot of the theistic points of heaven and stuff is it's not some kind of perfect system where the bad will be punished and the good will make it in. Because the analogies that I keep coming to is stuff like Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer killed these people, and then in prison right before he died, he accepted Jesus, at least according to him. Now, what happens in that situation? Did the people that he killed, being that they, according to the church and the teachings of the Bible, they were maybe promiscuous or whatever, they might have ended up in hell when Jeffrey Dahmer goes to heaven? I mean, that doesn't seem right. And it's the Hitler scenario, too. This guy oversaw the murder of 6 million Jews. And according to Christianity, if you don't believe Christ, you don't get to go to heaven. But Hitler at least professed to be a Roman Catholic, even if he wasn't. What if Hitler, before he killed himself, converted? So the idea of Hitler being in heaven and 6 million Jews burning in hell forever it leaves me kind of cold. It doesn't sound like a perfect system at all to me.
Very interesting. So what type of stereotypes about atheists do you personally want to confront and correct?
One that I can think of is, and you touched on that earlier, what it really means to be an atheist, and you're right on that too, it does differ for different people. I wouldn't be in the camp of there definitely is no God. I just see no reason to think that there is. That's the camp I would fall into. So that's one. Another one that it's not necessarily a bad stereotype, but it's just untrue, is the idea that all atheists are skeptics. I wish that was true, but it's not true. But the biggest one that I would want to see done away with is this idea that atheists have this grim view on life, like, oh, we're just balls of matter that just kind of float around for a bit, then when you're dead, that's it, and there's really no reason to do anything. And it kind of ties into the moral question too, the idea that's one of the first things I get when I tell like coworkers or whatever that I'm an atheist. That's one of the first things they come to is, why don't you just kill people? Like why are you here? Why aren't you out robbing a bank or something? It's sadly
that really
common.
Doesn't make, and I haven't decided what, personally, I don't mean to interrupt you, but as you've seen in previous videos, I haven't decided what I'm going to do, but that's not a very good argument.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you also got to remember I live in Texas, so I'm probably getting the worst of it.
When we talk about the future, right, sometimes it seems things are getting better, sometimes it seems things are getting worse. It seems like on the news, a voice like Richard Dawkins gets more positive attention. It seems like we're thinking about things and making advancements. But at the same time, there are countries like Pakistan and Iran and India and granted, I don't live there. I don't know what it's like, but it seems like these countries have a lot of very intolerant people, and it seems like, millions or hundreds of thousands of intolerant people, crazy people sometimes, and a lot of it has to do with religion. So do you think things are getting better or worse?
I guess it would depend on kind of how you look at it. In ways, things are getting worse in the sense that it used to be when somebody was, ignorant or believed these silly things that were dangerous, it was usually just confined to them and maybe a sword. But now you got guns, and then from that you get bombs. And then now we're living in the day and age where a couple of crazy people can wipe out cities with some of these weapons.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So in that instance, it is worse because just a little bit of ignorance goes way further than it used to. But in the sense that I think people are starting to become more reasonable, I think generally that is the case. But, I mean, what does it really take? It doesn't take, like I say, it doesn't take near as much to kind of ruin that for a lot of people,
That's true. When I talk to Iranians in particular, they usually tell me that the adults have the, I guess the fundamental Islamic view, but the kids, the teenagers, the early 20s, these kids like the United States and everything.
That's good, yeah.
The next topic I'm going to bring up is, I'm sure this is really what kind of got my interest. When people take offense when you don't believe, like, for example, what used to happen probably when I first started becoming, like I used to just go to church and whatever. I never thought about it, but I met some coworkers who were very big believers, and they would talk about Noah's flood, and they would talk about it as if it was a confirmed event, like the rain we had today or whatever. And I would say, like, I'm not so sure. And we're not even talking about whether God exists. We're talking about the story of Noah's Ark. And I would say, I'm not so sure that happened. And they would take offense and respond with anger and everything. And I'm sure you've experienced this in Texas. You tell someone maybe that's not true, and they come back with anger and like they're offended. Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think people take offense when you're, I mean, it's just not, like we can debate, like, how did the universe start? Maybe this, maybe this. Like, why do you think religious people will take offense when you disagree?
Well, I think in that last instance, what you were talking about is how, rational people can have those discussions, like scientists have that discussion. It's because we're operating on completely different methods than people that are biblical fundamentalists. The people that take a literal interpretation, there was really a 600-year-old guy that fit two of every animal into a boat. I mean, you're talking about two completely different things there. Most of the stuff we're talking about is a little more reasonable. When something sounds a little too extreme, we're able to sit back and look at it, like rationally and just look through it. In that instance, they're not, because a lot of these people, I can say from experience because I know so many of them, they see it as all a one-piece thing. They see it all, the Bible. If the Bible's wrong, no God could possibly ever exist. And I think that's one of the big problems, because when you start picking things out, like, the humans started in a magic garden with a talking snake, and then the 600-year-old guy on the boat with all the animals and stuff like that. When you start saying, like, well, this just isn't right, this isn't what we know about reality, the planet's not older than the universe, then they're like, oh, well, then you're trying to take their God away from them. It's kind of how they seem to see it. It's sad that it's like that, though.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, like you said before, I mean, I've had times where I've talked to, like, people that study, science, and if they say, I had someone say, I don't believe in the Big Bang, I believe in a competing theory, and I said, I'd probably stick with the Big Bang, and that's fine. They're not going to get angry at you and everything. So now I want to ask some questions about religious freedom. A lot of times, many atheist activists will point to bad things in religion. It brainwashes people, or they're stealing money, or whatever. But do you think we should maintain religious freedom? So when I'm done with the interview, maybe over the weekend, maybe my mother and I go to church. Like, should we be allowed to do that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I say, yeah. First off, I think everybody has the right to think and believe what they want to believe. Now, where I would maybe limit that is inflicting that on somebody else. But as far as believing the things that you want to believe, not just constitutionally, I say even if we didn't have the Constitution, you should still have that right as a human. But, yeah, there should be limits to the point of where, like, okay, I don't like this, nobody can have this, Like, you don't like eating bacon or something, and, like, nobody can have bacon, that kind of thing. That's ridiculous to me. But and also another thing is, how can you really pretend to stop people from thinking and believing things that they want to think and believe? I mean, you can try to argue against it and things, but I mean, like legally, if I was to say you're not allowed to think this, how will I ever know if you're thinking it or not?
That's a
I
good
mean, how could I even pretend to enforce something like that?
That's a very good point. I didn't even think about that. When people talk about their high moral character, I'm sure I'm sure you've run into this. Sometimes they'll say like, "I do the right thing because of the Bible," right? And they'll accredit their high moral character with the Bible. But of course, as you study the Bible, you know that the Bible is not this. There's murder and all types of crazy things in the Bible. So why would people accredit their good behaviors and their moral behavior with the Bible?
I would probably have to just speak, at least as an American on this, is, you know, in our society, Christianity has pretty much hijacked morality. I mean, I don't mean to necessarily make it sound that negative, but throughout the years, that's what you've seen. You've seen if somebody's good, for instance, politicians, you can't even make it in politics without professing to be a Christian. And I think that's one of the reasons is because everybody looks at it and they equate goodness with Christianity and everything else is just kind of bad. Like that's probably one of the reasons that atheists are seen as the least trusted, demographic in the nation. I mean, we're even under Muslims, and that says something in America because Muslims are not very high on the tolerated list. At least here in Texas, I'll tell you that much.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I think. I think it has to do more with that than anything real because, as you can look at nations around the world, the statistics, and they seem to show that people without religion have, or countries that have adopted or have a majority that don't have religion usually score better on societal happiness, healthcare, all these different kinds of things and stuff. So it doesn't seem like there's really a correlation with, somebody being secular or not Christian with being bad. I think it has more to do with just the culture. You know what I mean? Like it's like Christianity being made synonymous with morality.
Yeah, that's true. No, that I sent you something. I don't know if you had a chance. I sent you something about the New Jersey Libertarian Party. What happened was here in New Jersey, prostitution happens as I'm sure it does in Texas, and sometimes the women involved get beaten up. Sometimes they get murdered, and they're afraid to go to the police when they're beaten up. And a lot of times they're very vulnerable to get even killed sometimes because they're hiding from the police. And the Libertarian Party wanted to legalize it. They wanted sort of like what they have in Nevada, have it regulated and legalized. And this way the women involved, wouldn't get, probably wouldn't be in danger. But the religious right came in, as I'm sure you could predict, and they said, oh, it's anti-God, it's anti-whatever. And they really kind of stifled the path to legalizing it. Now, the other thing is the Libertarian Party was arguing whether it really was a crime to begin with. But again, the religious right groups, they really kind of took charge of it. It's not an easy decision, but when we address questions like that, what should we make legal? What should be illegal? What is your criteria? I mean, should we ever think about what a God wants? I mean, like, how would you go about a decision like that?
Well, I would say the problem with trying to find out what a God wants is how are you going to ask a God? And it's going to be a guy telling you God told him to, like, oh, God said this was bad, but he wants you to do this, That's been kind of classically the case. When you go about deciding things like that, one of the things that I say, it doesn't, I don't know, it might work for the problem or the issue anyways of prostitution, but I think morality should have a lot more to do with how people treat one another. I don't think it has as much to do with gay people getting married and but if it's totally consensual, if the woman is taking money or the man is taking money for sexual acts or whatever, it seems to me entirely their business and it doesn't seem to be any of mine. But in the instance that it does seem like it would be a better thing on a society, on a social scale, that maybe even if you kept it in a certain place and they did VD testing or whatever and they do all these kinds of things. But still, as a blanket, no. God says no, we can't do this. That sounds ridiculous to me.
That was a lot of the arguments.
And that's what's so sad is we don't even have real arguments against so much of this stuff. I mean, at least if they were going to put out some good argument for, I don't know, marijuana legalization or gay marriage or something like that, if they would at least put out a good argument. But all the arguments you hear is just like, well, God said no. That doesn't leave a whole lot of room for discussion, does it?
I think we talked over email about Tajikistan and what's going on there. It's very interesting. We talked about religious freedom. Now, their situation is probably maybe a little more difficult than ours because they're dealing with Muslim fundamentalists. But as you saw, the government stepped in and put some restrictions on religion. I think they made it that girls can't wear like Muslim scarves to school. And I think you pointed out that in Tajikistan, you're not allowed to have religious symbols publicly. And there were a couple different restrictions they put on religion. Is something like that ever appropriate? What's your take on that?
Well, I don't know, man. On a lot of the specifics of it, I'm not so sure on a lot of the specifics, but at least I could try to relate it to how we would do things here. I don't know what their rulings are of, how like their constitution or whatever is founded. Is it founded under a certain branch of Islam? See, those are things that I don't know. I never found some of those things out. I do know that they had made it to where, like, one part that I'd read is children under 18 aren't allowed to publicly be involved in any of, like, the religious ceremonies and stuff. I really don't know how you could, it depends on how far you go. The idea of, it does seem weird to me that kids under 18 couldn't, take part in a religious act or a ceremony just because it's so different than anything we have here. They really want kids involved in those acts here. So I'm really not too sure how to answer that.
My thing is, I think for them, it's probably, I mean, granted that they can run their own affairs, but I think for them in Tajikistan, it's probably a good idea. Just because obviously they may very well be dealing with people that are going to be terrorists,
Yeah.
Do you think we choose what we believe, or is what we believe a result?
Yeah, I think what we believe is a result of how convinced we are. I think you're compelled to believe things. This is another thing that I get into with people a lot, because my mom will always say this. She's like, I understand, all the science and stuff, you can have that, but can't you just believe in God? I'm like, but I just don't. I can't. I could tell her. I could tell anybody all day long, yeah, I believe in God. I could tell everybody I'm a Christian all day long. It doesn't change what I actually think. I don't think it's really like an on-off switch that I can just turn that on anytime I want to. It's more of the evidence that I see and all the things that I piece together just kind of bring me to one place. You know what I mean?
Yeah. After September 11th, which I don't know about in Texas, but certainly up here, it was like it happened in our backyard. And of course, the topic of Muslim terrorists thinking that they're going to get like virgins in heaven or whatever. There was a couple weeks where we were talking about that, and after 9/11, and I had a friend of mine who was the only atheist I knew at the time when the topic of the thing of being an atheist was kind of new to me. But he said, these suicide bombers who are expecting virgins, he said they don't even get a chance to be born because once you die, you're dead. And so a question that I try to ask everyone is, does a part of you wish they could be disappointed, right? Whether that means there's another afterlife or maybe we only have a minute. Like, does a part of you wish that somehow they could realize that they were wrong? They kill people thinking they're going to get virgins or thinking they're going to. Is there a part of you that wishes they could see? Like, wouldn't it be more fun if they could see they were wrong instead of just being dead?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would. I think and not just for them, but even for me, if it turns out that when I died, I could at least find out for a minute that I was right. That's one thing that I'd say sucks about atheism, is the fact that you're not going to get that kind of, like, what do you call it, closure, that you're just like,
that's a very good word.
Hey, out of all of this, like, I got it. I was right. Yeah, that's one thing that does suck about it.
No, that it's very interesting that you point that out, because when I've had experiences talking to very religious people and they say, like, you're not believing right and you're gonna go to hell, I'm like, I hope there is some type of afterlife and the God is just like normal and all you had to do was respect one another and you're fine, and so they could see that their craziness is not real.
Yeah, yeah. I think that would be great. I used to have that kind of, when I was going through my deconversion, I used to have this idea of like, what happened if you did die and you like went and there was like the light and you met God and he was like, hey, I gave you really no good reason to think any of that shit was true. So come on in. I'd love to hang out with you or something like that.
It's funny you should mention that. The Seattle atheists have talked about that. I think on their show, one of the guys said one time, maybe God really wants us to be atheists. Maybe God wants someone to think and say, all this crap can't really be, and
Yeah.
maybe those are the people that are going to be rewarded.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I bring that up sometimes to religious people, and they get a little upset. But I'm like, there's really just as much backing for that as there is this. If nothing else, I think this makes more sense because if this God did create us, he gave us these like rational brains for thinking. It seemed to me that he would rather you think than just believe stuff that you don't have any basis for.
That's a very good point. We actually kind of led well. Which brings me to this question. I try. This question doesn't always go over very well, but I try to ask it. And it kind of pertains to what we were talking about before. Have you ever thought that maybe what you're doing now, like how Christians will say, "Oh, it's God's plan," or "What happened is God's plan," or "God is a plan." Have you ever thought maybe your atheist activism, maybe that's what God wanted? Maybe there is a God, and as we said before, he really wants people to think about things and reject the religions. Like, have you thought maybe this is the God's plan for you?
Except for that last bit, what I was talking about, I guess what you would call maybe secular heaven. Except for just thinking about that. No, that is a really interesting idea, though. Yeah, I can't prove it's not, but I don't have any reason to think that it is. But it is definitely something interesting to think about. Yeah, that's pretty good. Nice.
I think. Because, well, no, that's good. I mean, I think Matt Dillahunty had an interesting answer when I asked him. Do you have any thoughts on Madalyn Marie OHair? Were you familiar with her? Is there anything that people should know about her?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I really like about Madalyn isn't necessarily just that she's an atheist, but you talk about a woman in the early 60s, especially since she was so well outspoken. I mean, when you watch like the videos, I've done a compilation of Madalyn on my channel, just a batch of all the different talks that she had. I mean, the lady had balls, man. And you're talking about coming out in the 60s as a woman, especially doing that and getting, prayer taken out of schools and everything. But that's one thing that I would want to clear up with people is the idea that you can still pray in schools. She got the state mandated prayer taken out of schools because that's one I've always heard. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. You point out, and we should point out that she started her stuff not in the late 60s, but in the early 60s, which was pretty much still the 50s,
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
60s don't start really until like 1967, the hippies, the protesting.
Summer love, yeah.
63, 64, 65 is still, it's still kind of like the 1950s.
Yeah.
And everything. Do you have any friends that are religious? Is that an issue for you?
All of my friends, except for I think 2, are religious, and of course my entire family is. The problems generally come with family more than they do with friends, and this is something. And you might have noticed this. You notice this with people around my age and even younger, people in their 20s. I'll say that they're a lot more open to having those kinds of conversations. Where you talk to like I guess what you call them the old guard, like my parents and grandparents and stuff like that. It's just no. What are you doing? When you talk to some of the younger guys, even the ones that are Christian, you can actually have a two-way conversation. You can go back and forth, at least in my experience.
Well, yeah, I think you talked about that before, because in their day, the older people, questioning God was blasphemous and disgraceful. But it's kind of, first of all, in popular culture, atheism is kind of rising, and I think that for the most part, reason kind of prevails as time goes on. Some of the people on the atheist experience have said, wait a generation and see how things go.
No, I don't think that's very far off at all. I mean, I don't want to go as far as to say that they have like a witch burner outlook on the world, but this kind of that far off, just like you're not supposed to really even be questioning those kinds of things. And there are some people that are younger that have that, but it's few and far between for people around my age or even younger to have those kind of ideas to do stuff like that. It's usually the older people, the older people that were in the church all the time. The people that came up and remember Madalyn Murray OHair is this just like devil lady.
Devil lady.
Yeah.
And she liked that. She got off on that stuff. And
yeah.
What do you think of people such as a Ken Miller, like someone who, there are many people who study science, who understand science, who understand evolution, who seem to understand astronomy. They understand everything we could know, and they still come away believing in God. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Does it bother you or whatever?
Well, I wouldn't say it bothers me so much that just we're disagreeing on that point. I would say one thing that I don't understand is how a scientist can kind of have those sorts of positions, not because the evidence does or doesn't bear it out, but just because science works on such completely different methods than religion does. I mean, faith works on it's faith, it's belief in something without or in contradiction to opposing evidence, and it has a lot to do with like wish thinking. And science is demonstrable. You can verify it. There's evidence. There's a reason that supports all these things. So that's one of the things that I come away with. I think it's really admirable guys like Kenneth Miller and Francis Collins, who's the head of the Human Genome, both evangelical Christians, but still understand like, well, this is just reality. This is how it happened. I respect them at least in that regards. I would love to ask them personally how they do that. How they kind of come away with that.
It's interesting because I talk to Catholic priests a lot about it, and the Catholic Church, I don't know if you're aware, but they are they try to maintain science. They're kind of in a funny state where they're trying to keep God, but they're saying, okay, we understand evolution happened, things like that.
And like I say, in this sense, I'm just really glad because it's so different from where I live. They don't try to balance science and religion. It's 6 days. It says 6 days. That's kind of how it is here.
144 hours. The whole
But one of the things that I would love to ask them, and I'm always really curious whenever I do meet Christians or people that believe in God, that do believe in evolution, and I got to say here it is pretty few and far between, but I have met some, and I'm always wondering how they balance that. Like the analogy Christopher Hitchens used to give. Homo sapiens been on the planet for 100,000 years at least, probably 200,000 years. Some say 250,000. Then you got to think that for all these years, forget that 99% of all life has died and gone extinct on the planet, and then these people come, and then just 2,000 years ago, God's like, okay, well, let's do something. Just like that kind of thing. It's really curious to me because it's like, well, what about them?
That's probably why they have to deny it. That's probably why.
Yeah, and it's probably a lot easier to deny it, it seems to me.
Here's a very interesting question when we talk about morality, right? So if there is no God and there's not going to be any punishments, and you kind of touched on this before, why do the right thing? Why care about others? If there's not a God and there's not a judgment afterwards, why not do bad things? I'm sure you've been asked that before, right?
There's different ways to answer it. It's the idea of where does morality come from? Is for instance, if you think God is the center of it, but I guess I can skip that and I can say, I think it doesn't really matter what the situation is, whether God exists or not. I think morality is still relative, just because you have the option to do whichever. If God, if we lived in a world where God stopped people from doing bad things, then I would just be like, okay, that's a little different. But it doesn't seem to happen that way. It seems that no matter what your position is on God existing, it still seems we do have the option to do either or. So we do have to come to these natural conclusions anyways, just like we do with everything else, of why it's good to do that, why it's good and bad to do certain things. And when it comes from God, the question is something moral because God commands it, or does something become moral if God commands it? And the difference is, if something is moral because God says it, then you could look through the Bible, and like a lot of people, they do try to justify the horrible things in the Old Testament, saying, well, God knew that was a plan. God promised them the land, and then when they come out, they're like, oh, there's, a dozen other tribes here. Well, slaughter and kill them all, and, all that kind of thing. And they would say, well, that was fine because God said that at that point. If that's how you want to do morality, I would say that's not morality. If you're acting out of hope for reward or fear of punishment, you're not being moral. Morality is what you do when no one's keeping score. I don't think anyone is going to be, looking over my name in a book of life when I die. I'm moral because it makes sense to be moral. I know how I want to be treated. I can extend that to other people. That's kind of where a basic sense of morality comes from. For me, is just empathy. And plus, human beings, we're social creatures. We get along. We rely on each other to live. It makes more sense to live in a way where we're good to each other, generally.
Very good answer, yeah. This was one of my first questions to Matt Dillahunty. He was talking about gay marriage and how God says, or how it is thought that God is against it. If a God existed, say, hypothetically, we determined that a God existed and we could communicate, does that get, if the God created us, does that give God authority over us?
I wouldn't. Maybe to what extent? I mean, of course, he could conceivably do whatever he wanted to do, right? I mean, if a God did exist, well, I mean, we couldn't stop him from, making us do whatever. But I don't think that would necessarily give him any kind of necessary control over us. I don't see how that would even follow. I'm curious how Matt would have answered that too. I would figure he probably would have said something along the lines of, if you had a kid, you don't get to just absolutely.
Well, he said it absolutely. He said it did not give. He was against the idea very much. He said, of course not, and he said that, exactly. He said if you had a kid, and he said, do you want someone to choose your college major for you? Should someone read the Bible?
Should someone?
Yeah, if someone.
I think that they should.
If you think the Bible is a lot of nonsense, right? Floods and dragons, and if the Bible is nonsensical, why should we read it?
So you'll know not to believe it. Is what I would say. It definitely worked in my case. I mean, it really is funny that when you first start hearing arguments against the Bible, I remember I would just be like, no, there's no way that's in there. I'm not even going to bother looking it up. There's no way that's in there. But then when people eventually get to the point where they get convinced to look it up, Exodus 21, you can sell your daughter as a sex slave. No way. This is no way that's in here. It must be a bad copy. And then I read through all the other ones and I'm like, wow, how? I think that's one of the good ones. And one of the books I always tell people, even if you won't read the whole Bible, just read Leviticus. If you can read Leviticus and come away thinking that this is anything other than people in the Bronze Age making shit up, then I don't know what to tell you.
I think Dave Silverman, he said he wants people to read the Bible and think, is this, and don't read it in a group, just read it like a book, don't have it be interpreted or anything like that.
Yeah, that's usually when they encourage you in church, read your Bibles, it's come to prayer group and read them with us, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Was there any question you saw in a previous interview that you liked, that you wanted to, that I didn't ask?
I don't know. I think you asked
a lot of.
No, your questions were really good, and it actually kind of upset me when I was reading your list. And I was like, because I do with Skeptic Fence, we ask all these people questions. I'm like, I never thought of any of these.
Oh, that's
good. And I'm looking through it. I was like, man, I might have to steal a couple from you.
Yeah, you certainly be. Did you want to? At this time, I usually end by. Do you want to ask me any questions?
Yeah, I would be curious what you thought on all that, on all the. What your beliefs are on God, and if you do believe in God, what do you call God? What do you think God is?
That's a very good question. It kind of goes, it goes in so many circles, and I'm really trying to find out for myself what I believe. I'm trying to talk to, as I mentioned, talk to religious figures, see what they have to say, and see how they, especially, I like what's going on in the Catholic Church where they're getting in touch with science. I think that it's kind of a funny thing. I think that the new wave of atheism is a good thing because I think we should reject the old, the old ways. But I still I believe that there is something. I mean, that might change. But, I do believe that there is a being that's responsible for the Big Bang. I don't think anyone deserves to be punished. But I don't think that it would care about you fasting, sort of like I think Hitchens said, it would get mad if you masturbate. I don't think that the God would care about that. You know?
I think all that you said I think it's really admirable, and I think you should look at it for yourself and think about all those little things. One thing that I would ask though, for instance, do you lean more towards because you said Catholic, more towards like a Christian kind of, and even in that, if you do lean towards Christian, like how far kind of do you go into that?
I am. It's very. I've been studying a lot. I took a class on the New Testament, and as you talked about, I've kind of really read a lot of the New Testament, and I found out a lot about. I think I'm kind of backing away from Christianity. I didn't want to do that, but a lot of this, there's stuff in the New Testament that we're not taught in church. Jesus kind of may have said and did a lot of things that I don't. That I wouldn't agree with. And also, we get into the argument for what evidence do we have? Was this stuff written 4 generations after the person lived? How did we come up with it? And also, what Jesus is so much different, or what Christianity is so much different when you talk to different people. You could go to a church pew and each person will have a completely different idea of what it is, and that really just doesn't make any sense. I mean, granted, I guess a lot of religions are like that. I have some Jewish friends who tell me Judaism is similar. I mean, it just, I think when I called the atheist experience, Don Baker talked about there are people that believe in God in general, and I think I believe in God in general.
Okay. Yeah, because one of the things I was going to ask is I have one friend that's kind of got a similar position, not Catholic, but a similar position in Christianity and stuff. And one of the things I always have to ask is, if you've already pretty much said the Bible's unreliable, I'm really wondering, because that's the only basis for any of it. So it's like, kind of, why would you keep that? The idea of God in general, like I say, I have a couple of friends that consider themselves deists, and I think I think the universe functions without that, but I still think it's a much more respectable position.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. The idea that God's not just ready to stick people in hell forever, that kind of thing.
And maybe we are being observed. I know that it doesn't make a difference, but I would prefer that there was a being and that there was an afterlife, sort of like a father or a parental figure. I would prefer it. I prefer, especially when someone. I've asked this question to atheist activists, would it be better if we went to heaven? A lot of them say, sure, but, we need to prove it first and everything.
Yeah.
I got to adjust. All right, man. Well, thank you very much for taking part, for being on the channel and everything. I really appreciate it. Was there any closing thing you wanted to say?
No, I was going to say thanks for having me. The channel's really good. I think I watched all of the Matt Dillahunty and a little bit of the Aronra. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's really good. I like what you're doing, and I look forward to seeing more of it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Have you met Aaron?
I've done an interview with him. I haven't met him in person. Yeah, I did one with him, and I did one with Matt, but I haven't met them in person though. I plan to, because I live in Texas. It's not too far away.
Yeah. All right, man. I'm going to turn the camera off now. But
all right.
Thanks again.